This program is brought to you by P. Murphy and Associates, successfully providing IT professionals to Southern California businesses.
Hi, this is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do? And today's guest is Ethel Andrews. And Ethel, what do you do?
Well, actually, I have dual occupations, both of which are decidedly downscale. I've had a cleaning and janitorial business since the late 1960s, and I also do mixology.
And your show is here?
Exactly,
You have
here
a
at
show at
KGM, called Good Libations.
And today we're going to talk about your love of your hobby, I would call it a hobby, of genealogy.
Absolutely.
So
yeah.
let's get started. When did you really know as a child? What drew you to this?
Well, both of my parents came from Europe. My dad from the British Isles, my mother from Slovakia. And I was always interested in our ancestry, even as a small child, like say ages 4 and 5. I used to pepper my dad with questions about, you know, what nationality is this surname? What nationality is that surname? And he got to the point where he said sometimes he would make things up because I drove him crazy.
Really?
Yes. But I was always interested in ancestry, but I've actually grown more interested as time went on in genetics and gene frequencies.
Now, what's gene frequency?
Well, even in the pre-DNA era, gene frequencies are population genetics related to what genes are carried in which population groups. And I've always been interested particularly in serology, which is blood groups, and the analysis of blood groups as it relates to populations, because you will find all 4 of the ABO blood groups in every population group, but in different percentages.
So there's AB.
O and then AB.
AB, yeah, I have a friend, she and her husband are both AB.
Yes, and that's the most rarest of the 4 groups on an ABO basis. And then combined with Rh negative, which also varies greatly among population groups, with Asiatic populations having virtually no Rh negative, they're all Rh positive, with Europeans having the most Rh negative, and then Africans second. So there's a lot to it, and this is all pre-DNA.
So at that time you had to go in and have these tests done, and that they would divide the serum up, the blood?
Exactly. In fact, when it came to solving crimes, it was incredibly difficult with serology, because in this part of the world and also in Europe, there's an incredible amount of people who are type O and type A. So it made serology more difficult. If you were Rh negative, it made it a bit easier. But in general, it was more difficult because of the commonality of those blood groups. And they would type other factors like PGM, which is phosphoglucomutase, but still it was not as definitive as DNA. And some crimes remained unsolved. And then there was the issue of some people being what are called non-secretors, which means that they do not secrete their body fluids into their ABO blood groups into their body fluids. So 20% of the population is like that. So if they had a rape kit, they still could not analyze the blood group if the person was a non-secretor, because there would be no evidence. So you were handicapped at that particular point in time.
And once DNA came in?
It changed everything, because it doesn't matter. Whether you're a secretor or a non-secretor, your DNA can be obtained and analyzed regardless, and everyone's DNA is unique, even within the same family, with the possible exception of identical twins. And there's even some controversy now about whether their DNA really is precisely the same.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There has to be more research into that aspect, but that's come up fairly recently.
So the DNA, okay, so with genealogy, because I want to get with your energy and trying to get this together as a whole, with the DNA, you can do almost anything in the genealogy area, right? Because they can go back. Now, you know I had my genealogy done. That's how we got into this conversation.
Your DNA and genealogy.
My DNA. So let's talk about, there are 3 basic testing, all 3, like there's 23andMe, and there's family tree, and then there's ancestry. How do people know what to pick?
Well, any of them are viable, definitely. And there's more to it even than that, because most of the DNA technology is PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. But then there's mitochondrial, which they can isolate even from hair without the root, which you cannot do with PCR. And then there's Y chromosome DNA, which is obtained, of course, only from males. But that's been very useful. As an example, that's how they found that Welsh males were closely related to males from the Iberian Peninsula, because their Y chromosomes matched. And because of that, they postulated way before PCR technology that the peoples of the Iberian Peninsula entered the British Isles, which they did.
But if someone's looking for, and they're trying to get this just even started, do they start with the big three, like the Ancestry, or, I mean, when I was doing my research, they're smaller groups.
Yes, there are, and I would say that the big three are probably the most accurate. I kind of have a bit of a preference towards AncestryDNA.com, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best for everyone.
So what's the difference between the Ancestry and the 23andMe and the others? Do they all use DNA, or do they use that PCR?
Yeah, they all use polymerase chain reaction, which is a form of analyzing your DNA that's probably the most diverse and the most precise.
I had to do the swab. I thought that was DNA.
It can be. You can do a buccal swab from the inside of your cheek.
Yeah, that's what I did.
Or a saliva sample, which is what I did with Ancestry.com. And either is a good source of DNA. In fact, usually with criminals, they will try to find their saliva when they're doing, forensic DNA. Yeah. Like they'll get a cigarette butt or a cup that's been discarded, or even, cutlery that a person has used, because saliva is a good source. But then again, the cells within the inside of your cheek, the buccal area, that's a good source of DNA also.
So when I got mine, and I'm just going to talk from my experience, and I see how everybody can relate to it. When I got mine, it was very technical. It showed where I came from, and then it showed where I could get. It was almost like this spreadsheet. To me, I mean, it was very, very complicated. And they said they had 250 relatives.
Yes, mine came out very similar from Ancestry.com. First of all, they showed all my DNA links, and I was surprised, because I thought, being that my dad came from Great Britain,
yeah,
and that we're mostly of Scottish origin, and my mom came from Slovakia, I thought, big deal. I'm going to find British Isles in Eastern Europe, but I found much, much more.
Okay, so so tell me what you found.
Well, I found on my dad's side a lot of Scandinavian, which is not a terrible surprise, because the Vikings did make incursions into Great Britain, especially northeast Scotland. Right. And I also found Iberian Peninsula, Italy, Greece, and also some Western Europe on my dad's side. And on my mother's side, I found peoples of the Caucasus, specifically Armenia, Eastern Turkey, and Georgia, and also a trace of Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry. Much, much more than I thought I would find.
So, okay, so did they do the circle for you and said how much is this and how much is that? So
all
you got
the percentages.
I came at 100%. So I mean, there was one circle, but because I didn't see the others.
Yeah. And with me, I found out the percentages of British Isles, Scandinavia, Iberian Peninsula, Italy, Greece, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. And curiously enough, Eastern Europe exceeded 50%, which shows that my dad would have to have some Eastern European ancestry also, even though he came from Great Britain. Because half of your DNA comes from each parent, and being that my mother had other factors in her, it had to be more than I would have thought possible.
I think family tree went back 6 generations.
And I also was given a huge list of over 400 people who are genetically related to me. And the first one listed was a second cousin. No surprise. She had my grandmother's maiden name as her surname, so. That was easy.
Well, the first one that contacted me was artificially inseminated.
Boy, that's a curiosity.
And
That's really interesting.
And he didn't find out till he was in his 30s.
Oh, my word.
And
yeah, there's always surprises.
There were a lot of surprises, and so I came the closest to him of all the people he contacted. But he didn't know he didn't even know he was Jewish till he was 30.
That's really interesting, and you wonder too how that all transpired.
I guess he didn't say how it transpired. He didn't. His mother was, I don't know, she was artificially inseminated, and there were markers, he said, for his mother being Jewish too.
Yes, what are known as haplotypes. That's very interesting.
Now, what is a haplotype?
Well, it can actually be used in the context of white blood cell typing also, which is called human leukocyte antigen typing. But related to DNA, it's sequences of DNA that are unique to certain ethnic groups.
Okay.
Just to put it simply, I mean, there's more to it than that, but that's a basic definition of what a haplotype can be as it relates to DNA.
So what does it mean in terms of, me? Is it in terms of me having children who I'm going to marry? What does it mean?
Well, they will inherit, your DNA sequences, and it'll show the totality of their DNA, and they definitely will all type as having Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry,
right?
Regardless of who their dad is.
Yeah. Now, my son is the only one. I mean, because my father-in-law died, and my husband died. So David, if he went in for testing, how would he go about it? Because it's usually through the mother. A lot of this is they're talking about. When I got the results from Family Tree.
Well, a similar thing would happen as what happened with you, is if he sent in the buccal swab results, he would find out all his dad's background DNA-wise, plus what he already knows of your background, which is 100% Ashkenazic.
Right.
And he would find out the specific linkages his father has and what percentage of those linkages.
So he'd get
also.
the circle.
You got it. And he would
He'd have the
doubtless get
circle.
British Isles because his dad had Scottish,
Right.
possibly Irish background.
No, I think it's all Scots.
All Scottish, yeah.
I think it's all Scots and Alsace-Lorraine. But, it's very, and I wanted to have you on the show because we've talked about this a lot. It's very confusing for a beginner to really understand what they're telling you, because they don't explain words real well. Luckily, I went back and I watched some of the YouTube.
Which was wise.
Yeah,
because then you get a better grasp of it.
Yeah, I mean, because when I saw that it looked like an Excel spreadsheet, I thought, is this it? I was expecting a little report, real this little typewritten report. You're this, then goes on to the history and blah blah blah. So this was, it was real confusing to me.
Much more. And by the way, speaking of Alsace-Lorraine, which is the province that went back and forth between France and Germany, where Strasbourg is, Germans, French, Dutch, Belgian, Swiss, and Austrians will all type as Europe West. There's really not too much difference in their DNA, which, infuriates French and German people because they sometimes don't especially care for one another, and I'm talking about French and Germans in general. Now, there are differences in their haplotypes, but usually your Ancestry.com, your 23andMe, and so forth, they don't go beyond that. You have to get more definitive DNA. Like with my mother's Eastern Europe ancestry, that doesn't really tell you if she's Polish, Slovak, Czech, Bulgarian, or what. I mean, I know she's Slovak. If she had other tests, it would show her specifically to be Slovak. And then even within that, it would show whether she was Lemko, Boyko, or Hutzel, which are subgroups of Slovak DNA. So it can get even more complex.
I think I started off, the only one I've done so far is the $99 special. And
Same
then
with me.
And then they're trying to upgrade you into all the others. I mean, some of them go up to $1,000.
Oh, yeah.
So on the as each grade goes up, they just give you a little more information? Or see, I don't know how far back they go.
Oh, they can get pretty technical, and you can find out more. Like with the Europe West,
Yeah.
it would tell you specifically what you were, if you were Belgian, French, German, Dutch, Swiss, Austrian, and it would even determine, the Alsace-Lorraine as well. But that requires, like you said, more testing and more outlay of money. And the same thing with British Isles. There are haplotypes that are unique to certain sections of Britain. And this is the funny thing, too, when it comes to Welsh and Scottish DNA and English, it all comes under the category of British Isles because there is not really too much difference between Celtic DNA from Scots and Welsh, to the chagrin of the Scots and Welsh, and English DNA. And also the English always try to differentiate themselves as Anglo-Saxon rather than Celtic. Can't really tell their basic DNA
What
apart.
about the Irish? Where does that?
Now the Irish do have DNA that is unique to them only, because they're a separate island. But again, Scots and Welsh people with basic DNA cannot be differentiated from English unless you start getting into the haplotypes. And I found that really funny. But the unique bond with them all is basically northern Spain, that part of the Iberian Peninsula. Those were the first people to enter the British Isles, even before the Celts, the Picts, the Vikings, the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, all those other groups of people. The Normans, they all entered later. It was Iberian Peninsula first. The Romans later on also.
Well, I was going to say, the Irish are the strongest. I think they have a high addiction rate to alcohol. Now, would that show up in the blood?
It will show up in certain factors. There's an enzyme, ethanol dehydrogenase, that has to do with the rate that your liver will oxidize alcohol. And people who have a high rate of that enzyme, curiously, will become more addicted to alcohol because they can metabolize it more quickly. And all over pockets of Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and among Irish Celts, they do have high amounts of that enzyme. So it will show in blood work, even separate from the DNA.
So what are other enzymes to look for that show other things?
Oh, there's a whole host of things. It's a defective enzyme that produces Tay-Sachs disease.
Okay.
As an example, hexosamine A, which is carried by about 20 to 25% of Ashkenazic Jews, but not, curiously, by Sephardic Jews. The same thing with cystic fibrosis. That's a defect that is carried, among Europeans almost exclusively, unless there's intermarriage with other groups.
Right.
And that's a defective enzyme that relates to phenylalanine. The same thing with PKU, which also relates to phenylalanine.
What's phenylalanine?
It's an enzyme, actually, that is one of the building blocks of protein. And children who have phenylketonuria lack an enzyme where they don't process phenylalanine correctly. It builds up in their central nervous system, and unless treated and interfered with in their early years, will cause severe mental retardation. But now they can interfere with it by giving them a diet that takes out the phenylalanine, and they're perfectly normal as adults with normal intellect. So these things are important.
Well, if you're going to go for testing for the DNA, do you do the enzyme test at the same time, or do they? No, you have to do the enzyme.
Totally separate.
So is that part of the? It's not part of the DNA sequencing or anything, is it, or isn't it?
Well, it's tested differently, from the DNA, using other means and other tests. But usually, it's wise to find out some of these things. Like, usually, if two people marry, as an example, who have Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry,
Right.
they will ask one of the couple to be tested for Tay-Sachs. And only if they test positive will they ask the other person to have a test for Tay-Sachs. Because if you're a carrier, but your mate is not, you don't have to worry, because it's an autosomal recessive defect, meaning that you both have to be carriers to produce a child with Tay-Sachs. The same thing with cystic fibrosis, the same thing with phenylketonuria, the same thing with sickle cell.
Now, sickle cell is mainly among blacks, right?
Central African, yeah, people with Central African ancestry. And the same
Oh,
thing
it's
with
just central?
thalassemia. That's people unique to the Mediterranean. So there's all kinds of things.
Well, in all your studies, and you've been doing this for a long, long time, right?
Fascinated with it.
Have you gone into like South America?
Well, see, that's another thing too.
Or you know, or Africa?
South America, as an example, is a melting pot, because Brazilians have Portuguese influence, they have
Right.
influence from Africa, just as an example. Argentina, a lot of influence from Italy, from Germany, and there's a huge Ashkenazic element in Argentina
In Argentina,
and Brazil also, and even Paraguay, Uruguay. Again, it's a melting pot, but the indigenous population of South America is an Indian population, Native American population.
Okay. And now there are a lot of Native American populations that have never intermarried outside. So are they more contained with their?
Sometimes they sure can be, and they have certain things that are called fixed alleles. Like people who are 100% Native American, with the sole exception of the Blackfoot Indians, and with South American Indians, I mean 100%, blood group O Rh positive. It's called a fixed allele, meaning that that particular genetic trait is fixed within the population. And it's only because of the other ethnic groups entering South America that we now have more diversity of blood groups. And the same thing in Africa. It used to be that African tribes would only intermarry within their tribe. That's why today when people find out that they have African ancestry, it's broken down into tribes, because a person who has DNA from Ghana will differ from, we'll say, Ivory Coast, Mali, Senegal. It's all unique DNA.
Now, do they have, with the enzymes, is that all unique too, from Ivory Coast to Senegal?
It can be, depending.
Really?
Now, as far as sickle cell is concerned, that's pretty much indigenous to Central Africa. So if you come from anywhere in the Central African republics, and it can also go down into South Africa and North Africa, there's a chance that you could carry sickle cell. And there's some Caucasians who find out that they actually have African ancestry, and they turn out to be sickle cell carriers, even though they may look 100% European. So there's a lot to
really?
it. Also, people who have no knowledge of having Ashkenazic Jewish ancestry have come up as carrying Tay-Sachs also. So,
Well, you know, this man who contacted me, I think he was so surprised because he was, and then they were looking at the traits. I can't sing worth a damn, but my mother had a lovely voice, and my grandpa played the violin, and so he was asking me all these questions in the email, and it was like me going back all these years. You know, it's a long time. My mom's been gone a long time, and I'm going down memory lane, and the way he spelled my name, because he spelled it with the German, with the little
like an umlaut.
the umlaut, you know, and he's living in Austria now. He was from Philadelphia. And he's living in Austria.
That's interesting. He's
Yeah.
gone back to Europe.
He's gone back to Europe. So he was, you know, he asked me all these questions, and then he wanted to know. My mother had one brother, I remember, but he died, and I never met him. So my mother would talk about him. But you know, when you're a kid, you don't think about all of this. You did because you were real interested. Most kids, you know, they don't care. You know,
It's true.
They
It's
don't.
true.
I mean, you're trying to keep track of this family tree, and you think who's who in this. So nothing from my father's side yet. It's all been from my mother's side, which I have found even more fascinating.
That actually is, and of course, depending on who took the DNA test, because not all of our ancestors and relatives have taken that DNA test, so there's going to be people missing. because some people are just not that interested. I was dying to take the DNA test because I wanted to find out, as you did. But some people don't care.
I was always curious. I mean, as I've gotten older, I've just been very curious about it.
To me, it seems natural. It seems like everybody should be. But some of my friends that I presented the idea to that I took the DNA test, they went, "What did you want to do that for?" Not everybody is interested, so some of our relatives are not going to show up, on the list of people because they don't want to do their DNA or don't care.
What would you tell people if they were just starting off and we're having this conversation? What would you tell them to do?
Do the DNA, because you can research your surnames and who you think your relatives are, but your DNA is going to tell you who you really are.
Okay.
That's the difference. It's like that young man that we saw the 2020 special about, who actually
Why don't you explain this what we saw?
Oh yes, there was this gentleman named Paul Franzak, and he supposedly had been stolen at birth and then reunited with his parents 2 years later. Well, he sensed that he was not their biological child. And he had his DNA done, and you bet he wasn't. It proved conclusively they could not possibly have been his biological parents. Bottom line is, when he got his DNA results back, the largest ethnic group that was within him, he was 37% European Jewish, Ashkenazic in other words. And then he had other things in him, mostly Western Europe and probably British Isles, whatever. But that came as a real surprise to him because, of course, he was baptized and raised as a Roman Catholic.
Right.
Polish father, Croatian mother. So it was like he finally found out who he was, and then he was able, via the links that they give you, to find, first of all, a third cousin. And her name was Fran Kirby. And then he found out who his biological parents actually were. And he found out he had a twin sister, and nobody knows what happened to her.
No.
And it was quite a story, but the DNA was what told him.
It was a hard story too.
Oh, it was awful.
Because
sad.
He went on this quest to find everybody, and it really hurt his adopted parents.
Yes, they felt like he didn't care about them, and yet he loved them, and they did a beautiful job raising him, but they felt hurt and they didn't want to relive
that whole experience of it was a hard story. So I wonder, sometimes if people are adopted, do they really want to find out?
Oh yeah, and it can open up the proverbial can of worms, because sometimes the biological parent who gave them up does not want to find out. It can be, and it's led to some really sad, what should have been a happy reunion. It's led to some really sad things, people even being shooed off in very unceremoniously and unkind ways. Other times it's produced a wonderful reunion. And in fact, I know a person very well who was reunited with her biological half-brother and half-sister who look incredibly like her. I mean, they look like full-on siblings.
Well, the boy who was stolen, he didn't look like either one of his parents.
He really didn't.
Even when they
look like his
aged
brother.
him out, and
Not at all, not even remotely. So he just knew intrinsically.
Right.
And he loved his parents, and they loved him. I mean, no question about that. But they didn't really want to find out even who their real child was, which I found odd. But they had reasons of their own because of their own feelings, and really the gut-wrenching experience that they went through of having their baby stolen right from the hospital. That was horrible.
Yeah, that was
horrible.
Yeah. So I imagine a lot of these things can be linked, but sometimes is it worth it?
Yeah, it's like people who, there are tests now where you can find out if you carry the, BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene, for breast cancer. And it's a two-edged sword. Sometimes people don't want to find out if they carry that, because if they do, there's a huge chance, percentage-wise, that they will develop breast cancer. There's also a chance they might not. And there's a chance, too, that you can be discriminated against in your employment if it becomes known that you carry certain genetic diseases. So again, it is a two-edged sword.
Well, you're under confidentiality with that stuff.
Seemingly so, but somehow things can become uncovered, legal or illegal. And that's really sad. Plus, how would you like to find out if you carried that? I mean, that would be horrible to know that maybe, because, you know, Angelina Jolie did that, and that's why she had those extensive surgeries.
Well, 23andMe, that was very controversial about the health part, not about the DNA, but the health part.
Because, as you know, there are sites that you can link with your DNA results that will tell you pretty accurately what your, you know, genetic propensities disease-wise are.
Now, which sites are those? I didn't know about those.
There's one that's called something like Prometheus, but I haven't really looked into it. I'll have to find, you know, the accurate name for that. And even now, there's a lot of controversy about this, but even under serology, well, there's a book in UCLA's biomed library called Blood Group and Disease Associations, because some doctors dismiss as a pseudoscience that book that's out about eating right for your blood type and blood groups and disease, but there is true science behind it. That book would not be, and that's been out
for a long time.
Since the 60s. That wouldn't be at the biomed library unless there was credence to it.
Oh, I've read that book, and I'm A negative. I fall into all the things they say I like and I don't like.
Oh, yeah.
I'm very, very close, very close.
And I'm O negative, and the food preferences, accurate as can be, and if I eat properly for my type, I feel much better. And the disease associations seem very accurate too. And again, with that book being at the biomed library, and it's not Dr. D'Adamo's book, it's a different one that's been in existence since the 60s and late 50s. But that's a whole other subject.
Right, right.
Again, certainly your DNA would show what your propensities are disease-wise.
Well, if everything's happened in, the Tigris, Euphrates, how did all this other stuff happen?
You mean the diversity of ethnic groups?
The diversity of ethnic groups. How did all this, since
gene pooling and geography, when people move to an area and intermarry within that same group, whatever it may be, you're going to get certain genetic characteristics, even appearance-wise. You'll get that. Like, it's kind of a stereotype, but true. Blondes in Scandinavia.
Well, they're blondes.
Light-colored eyes. Right. In Northern Europe.
But they migrated there, right? I mean, they came out and
people with those characteristics migrated there, and then they intermarried, because blonde hair, light-colored eyes, and for that matter, blood group O, are recessive characteristics that are usually masked by dominant genes. And the irony about blood group O is that it's the most common blood group on a worldwide basis, but it's actually not a dominant characteristic, it's recessive. So if you carry a gene for type A or B, it will mask group O, and you will type as either A or B, even though you may carry a recessive for O, which you do because your son wouldn't be group O.
Right, I'm A negative. Yeah, I'm A negative, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that.
So it's gene pooling in geographic areas that produce characteristics, and also characteristics can become bred out the more that people become genetically diversified. That's why Caucasian people in this country often find out that they carry DNA from Africa, because people intermarried with Africans, but dominant characteristics got bred out, so to speak, even though they will still show up in your DNA.
And how about Asian countries?
Similar type thing. When people intermarry in those same ethnic groups, they produce certain characteristics like straight dark hair. It's a stereotype, but it's true. Brown eyes. The skin with a, quote, yellowish cast. Yeah. I mean, there is really a lot to it. It's like I mentioned to you earlier, even with Slovak people, your DNA types, when they're looked into more, will type as certain subgroups within Slovaks, the Lemkos, the Boykos, and the Hutzels, for a few of them. And also, we've talked about this before, but Sephardic Jews do not have the same DNA as Ashkenazic Jews do.
Isn't that interesting?
Different.
Yeah.
Like Neil Sedaka is a Sephardic Jew, and his DNA would be different from an Ashkenazic Jew. Sometimes they overlap a bit, but it will tie it very often as simply Middle East rather than European Jew.
Well, what about Iranians?
Because many of them are Persian Jews.
Yeah.
So that would type, in many cases, as Middle East rather than European Jew or Ashkenazim. And we talked a bit about this before too, but the point of entry to the United States was not always Ellis Island.
Well, no, I knew it was San Francisco was a big point.
Definitely.
I mean, I'm from the East Coast, so it was Ellis Island. I just never thought.
Galveston Island also.
Yeah. See,
Yeah,
I had
Jews of Galveston. Galveston was a huge entry point for Ashkenazic Jews. That's where there are so many in Texas and Louisiana.
well, the Ashkenazic Jews. I mean, the Sephardic Jews were here before the Ashkenazic Jews.
That's true too.
They came in the early 1700s. They settled in the South.
Yes, many of them did in New Mexico. Huge Sephardic Jewish population in New Mexico, parts of New Mexico. Many people who are, quote, Latino found out that they were Ladino, which is what they call Sephardic Jews. They found out that their ancestry was actually Sephardic Jewish and that they're not, strictly speaking, Mexican. Yeah, that came as a surprise to many, many people.
I imagine.
Yeah.
I imagine that. I know in the United States there are more Ashkenazic Jews
Definitely.
than the Sephardic Jewish population. It's much smaller.
Much smaller.
Yeah. But well, the Greek Jews are Sephardics. The Italian Jews are Sephardic.
Absolutely. Turkey.
Yeah.
Any countries that abut the Mediterranean where they have Jewish populations are considered to be Sephardic. And of course, Spain was the biggest source until, the Inquisition. That was
But they don't know what
terrible
happened.
chapter of history.
Yeah, and they don't know what happened to a lot of those Jews came over, and they went north and into. Well, some of them went into Denmark.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
down.
And also, other Scandinavian countries too, Sweden as an example. And the same thing with European Jews. That one Swedish actor, Erland Josephson, is of Ashkenazic Jewish origin.
Yeah, that's how they came in.
Yeah.
So if people are looking, that you recommend that they go to the top three and start there.
Yeah, that is the best thing to do, even before you get into, finding out who your ancestors are. The DNA tells you much, much more because that's who you really are.
Right. So we're going to wrap up, right?
Okay. I'm Ethel Andrews, and actually I have another show on KGM that pertains to mixology. But if you want to contact myself or Marlene, contact us via KGM. 357-4974. 626 area code.
Thank you, Ethel.
Thank you. Again, I'm Ethel Andrews, and I really enjoyed being interviewed by Marlene.
Thanks. This is Marlene Gibb with What Do You Do?